In the quiet suburb of Kings Park, the streets were still, except for the soft shuffle of mourners stepping out of a modest brick house. They had just buried a woman, or so they thought. Across the street, a dark-colored car sat parked under the shadow of a tree. Its engine was off, and inside, Noela Rukundo was watching the last guests leave her own funeral. She had been declared dead just days earlier. Her husband, Balenga Kalala, had told the community she'd been killed in a tragic accident while visiting family in Burundi. The news had spread fast. Friends brought flowers, the church held a service, and everyone came to say goodbye. Now Kalala was at the door, shaking hands, nodding somberly, pretending to be the grieving widower. He didn't know she was watching. Then Noela stepped out of the car. She just walked, slowly, deliberately, across the street, straight toward him. Kalala looked up. At first he froze, then his mouth dropped open. He blinked, hard, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Is it a ghost?" he whispered. "Surprise," she said. "I'm still alive." He staggered back a few steps, hands flying to his head like someone trying to hold in a scream. Then he stepped forward and touched her shoulder twice. She was solid, he realized in that moment, that she was real. He started shaking, then came the tears. His knees buckled slightly. "Noela, I'm sorry. I love you. I didn't mean to." But she had already dialed the police, and they were just around the corner. And Kalala had no idea what was coming next. So how did we get here? How does a woman go from mourning a parent to being kidnapped, to crashing her own funeral? Let's go back to where it all started. To understand what happened outside that Melbourne funeral, we need to go back to January 2015, to the heat and sorrow of Bujumbura, the capital of Burundi. Noela Rukundo had flown in from Australia just days earlier, heart heavy and mind clouded. Her stepmother, the woman who had practically raised her, had passed away. The loss hit hard, and despite tensions at home, her husband Balenga Kalala had surprisingly given her permission to travel alone. It struck her as odd, but she didn't question it at the time. She had more urgent things to focus on: grief, family, and final goodbyes. There wasn't enough room in the family home for everyone staying for the funeral, so Noela booked a small room in a nearby hotel. It was simple but private, a place where she could help her relatives during the day and return to rest at night. By the third day, she was physically drained and emotionally spent. She had spent hours helping organize meals for the guests, sitting with family, comforting others, and crying until her head throbbed. That evening, just before 8 p.m., she returned to her room to lie down. The room had no working air conditioning, just the distant hum of city noise outside her window. That's when the phone rang. It was Kalala, and he told her, "Go outside, get some fresh air. It'll help you relax." It was an odd suggestion, but coming from him, it almost sounded like an olive branch. And after all, they'd been married 10 years. She still wanted to believe there was care beneath the cracks. So she slipped on a pair of sandals and walked out of her room. And then, it happened. A man stepped out from the shadows, walked toward her with purpose, and pointed a gun directly at her face. "Don't scream," he said coldly. "Walk slowly to that car." The vehicle was already there, engine running, headlights off. A van, dark and silent, parked just beyond the front gate. She obeyed the man's command and walked toward it, heart pounding so loud it drowned out her thoughts. Behind her, another man emerged and closed the gate quietly, as if trying not to disturb the night. When the van door slid open, 2 more men were waiting inside. She was pushed in, and the door slammed shut behind her. One of them took out a scarf and tied it tightly over her eyes. The vehicle pulled away, and for nearly 40 minutes, all she could do was sit in silence, blindfolded, sweating, terrified, wondering where they were taking her and whether she would ever see her children again. And so began a descent into something Noela couldn't have imagined, something even her nightmares hadn't prepared her for. But this wasn't a robbery, this wasn't a random abduction, this was a plan. But to understand how a man could arrange for his wife to be kidnapped and killed, you have to go all the way back, to 2004, to the very beginning of Noela Rukundo's life in Australia. She had arrived in Melbourne as a refugee, carrying not just the trauma of her past, but the weight of 5 young children depending on her. She had lost the father of her children back in Africa and had fled Burundi seeking safety, stability, and a chance to rebuild. Her English was limited, and every day presented a new challenge: navigating buses, applying for support, trying to make sense of a new country while still carrying grief. That's where she met Balenga Kalala. He too was a refugee, this time from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he had his own kind of sorrow stitched into every corner of his story. Years earlier, rebels had stormed his village. He was just 24 when they forced him to watch as his wife was brutalized and killed, their baby son slaughtered in front of him. For Kalala, survival was a necessity he carried with him when he eventually made it to Australia. Noela and Kalala met at a resettlement agency in Melbourne. They didn't fall into love, they were nudged into familiarity by circumstance. They had the same social worker, and since Kalala spoke fluent English and Noela didn't, the worker would often ask him to help translate. These weren't long conversations, but small exchanges, practical, transactional, but slowly becoming personal. And so, the two started seeing more of each other. Not romantically at first. Noela was cautious. She had already lost one family and didn't want to risk another. Kalala, on the other hand, was patient. He told her that he understood pain, that he respected her role as a mother, that he wasn't looking to replace anyone, but rather to build something new with her. People in the community called him dependable. He had found work at a seafood processing plant, later switching to a warehouse job as a forklift operator. He wasn't flashy or charismatic, but he was consistent, and at the time, that felt like enough. For a woman raising 5 children on her own, the idea of having someone stable beside her was a comfort. Eventually, friendship became companionship, and companionship turned into commitment. And by March 31st, 2012, they stood together in a church and exchanged vows. Kalala promised to love her. He promised to be a father to her children. He promised to protect her, to build a future together, and to put the past behind them. In the years that followed, they had 3 more children together, bringing the total to 8 in their blended family. They moved into a home in Kings Park, a suburb of Melbourne that was quiet, modest, and close to their church. On Sundays, they sat in pews together. They joined prayer meetings. They became familiar faces in the local African community, people who had endured suffering, but who had found a way to start over. But that image, like so many in true crime, wasn't the full picture, because while Noela had come to Australia to escape violence, she didn't realize she had slowly walked into something just as dangerous, just better disguised. What began as a promise of safety would soon turn into something else entirely, and it wouldn't take long for the cracks to show. At first, it was framed as care. He would ask where she was going, who she was meeting, and when she'd be back. But over time, those questions became accusations, and those accusations became rules. He started dictating what she wore, telling her which friends she could visit, and monitoring her time outside the home. He insisted she check in constantly, and grew agitated if she took too long at the market or came home a few minutes later than expected. He would flip through her phone when she wasn't looking, demand to know who had called, and accuse her of hiding things even when there was nothing to hide. Then came the violence. The first time he raised his hand, it came during an argument over something small, something so forgettable she wouldn't even recall what sparked it. But the slap wasn't forgettable, nor was the way he apologized afterward, crying and swearing he didn't mean it, blaming the war, the past, the trauma. And like so many victims of domestic abuse, Noela found herself caught in a cycle: hurt, apology, hope, repeat. She wanted to believe that the man she'd married still existed under the surface. She hoped it was the trauma talking, the PTSD he never treated, the scars of watching his first wife and child murdered. And because of that hope, and because of the cultural shame that often follows divorce in close-knit communities, she stayed. He had been through so much, she would later say. I didn't want to abandon him. Noela genuinely felt sorry for him. She saw him not just as an abuser, but as a broken man, a survivor who didn't know how to heal, and instead turned his pain outward. He had been through hell, and she convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, she could pull him back from it. But that was the lie she told herself. Because Kalala wasn't pulling himself back, no, he was pulling her in. And as the years passed, the man who once offered her a fresh start had become the very thing she had fled so many years ago. She had escaped war in Burundi, but she hadn't escaped danger, not really. It had just taken a different form, one that lived under her roof, kissed her goodnight, and told her he loved her, while quietly building a plan to destroy her. Now, let's go back to what happened after she was kidnapped. When Noela Rukundo came to consciousness, she wasn't sure how long she had been unconscious. Her wrists burned from the rope that held her to the wooden chair. Her heart pounded in her chest as fragments of memory started falling back into place. The car, the gun, the blindfold, and his voice. She had heard Kalala's voice, clear and unmistakable, giving the command. Kill her. She sat there in the center of a bare, crumbling room with the shadows of 4 men shifting around her. One paced slowly, another leaned against the wall, arms folded. The third cleaned the barrel of a gun, and the fourth, the one they seemed to defer to, stood directly in front of her, watching her like he was trying to measure her fear. Then he stepped closer. What did you do to make him want you dead? Noela couldn't answer. She just shook her head. Nothing. He's my husband. The men laughed. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was bitter, mocking, and cruel. You're a fool, the leader said. You still think that man loves you? But they didn't hit her. They talked sometimes in Swahili, sometimes in French, thinking she couldn't understand all of it. But she caught enough to realize something terrifying. They had been hired weeks ago. One of the men mentioned November, 3 months earlier, when Kalala first approached them about a job. He hadn't even waited for Noela to board her flight. He'd already been laying the groundwork, reaching out to underworld contacts, moving money through Western Union, and discussing how to make her disappearance look like a tragic accident. And now she was sitting in the middle of that plan, alive, terrified, and still trying to make sense of what was happening. When she insisted they were mistaken, that Kalala would never do something like this, the man simply pulled out his phone again. You still don't believe us? He tapped the screen. This time, the call wasn't live. It was a recording. Kalala's voice again. Yes, that's her. Make sure she's dead. Then came the twist. The man in charge, dark shirt, no expression, stepped forward again. You're lucky. We don't kill women or children. That's our rule.
I was so shocked and scary, and it was like my heart was already gone. I can see I'm already dead. They said their agreement of their job, they are not kill women and the children.
At first, she thought it was another mind game, but then he added something else. We know your brother. That changed everything. One of the men had recognized her name. He had ties to someone in her extended family. That connection, combined with their own twisted code, saved her life. But that didn't mean she was free. They weren't letting her go just yet. "We'll keep your husband's money," the leader said, "and we'll tell him the job is done." And so, they made a new plan. One of the men called Kalala again on speakerphone and told him, "She's dead. It's done."
So they told me, "We're going to keep you until when our payment is paid off, so we let you go."
But Kalala didn't ask questions. Instead, he wired them another $3,400 just to make sure everything was clean. He even cried on the call, saying, "I loved her. I can't believe she's gone." The men played along and they assured him the body wouldn't be found. Meanwhile, Noella was still tied to that chair. The hitmen weren't gentle, but they didn't hurt her. They fed her bread and water. They told her the truth, that they had taken the job only to keep someone else from doing it, someone who might have followed through without hesitation. Then they handed her an envelope. Inside were 2 Western Union receipts showing the payments from Kalala, a memory card with recordings of the phone calls. And then they gave her a warning. "You have 80 hours. Get out of this country. Tell your story if you want, but never come back." And with that, they blindfolded her one last time and dropped her near her hotel, just as the sun began to rise. She stood on the side of the road, alive, holding evidence that proved her husband wanted her dead. While Noella Rukundo was hiding out on the outskirts of Bujumbura with proof of her husband's betrayal clutched in her hands, her family was spiraling into panic. Back in Burundi, her brother had started calling everyone he could think of, hospitals, police, even the embassy, but no one had seen her. It had been 2 full days, and she hadn't answered her phone. So he reached out to the one person who should have cared most, Balenga Kalala. He explained that Noella had vanished from her hotel. No one knew where she was. Something was wrong. And to move the case forward, the local police needed money, about $545, for the search effort. Kalala didn't hesitate. He wired the cash immediately, and that might have been the most chilling part, how quickly he played along. He sounded worried. He asked the right questions. He pretended to be shocked, and with that transfer, he put on one more layer of the grieving husband act. But it was all theater. By then, Kalala believed Noella was already dead. In his mind, the hit had gone through. The job was done. His money had taken care of the problem. So now he was performing, laying the groundwork for the final chapter, the funeral.
Because when he told them, he was crying like a small child. He was crying. "Oh, my wife, I love my wife so much. I can't believe he left me. Oh, the kids, blah, blah, blah." So the people that was believe him, because he's the one who keep talking to my brother in Africa, and he says, "Oh, my brother said they didn't find my body, or they didn't find." So
Meanwhile, Noella had no time to waste. Once the kidnappers let her go, she made a single call to her brother. His voice on the other end cracked when he heard hers. She told him she was safe, not to tell anyone, and that she needed help. Then she made a second round of calls. First to the Belgian embassy, then the Kenyan embassy. She needed safe passage. She couldn't fly commercial, not without protection, not without clearance. And the moment Kalala realized she was alive, she'd lose her only advantage. The embassies worked quickly. Documents were prepared. A travel route was cleared. And quietly, without alerting the media or the authorities in Burundi, Noella was placed on a plane and flown out of the country. And before she landed, she made one last call, this time to her pastor in Melbourne. She trusted him, and she needed someone who could help her return without Kalala catching wind. "Don't tell anyone," she said, "just help me get home." And he did. So on February 22, 2015, with her husband still preparing for her memorial, Noella Rukundo stepped off the plane at Melbourne Airport. It was the night of February 22, 2015, and Balenga Kalala stood outside their home in Kings Park, Melbourne, playing the role he had prepared for so carefully, the grieving husband. Friends, neighbors, and members of the Congolese-Australian community had gathered to mourn Noela Rukundo. They hugged Kalala, offered prayers, brought food, and wiped his tears. He held their hands, looked down, and whispered words of sorrow. Some of them cried with him. But everything he said was a lie. And as the final guests began to trickle out and the house emptied into silence, something shifted. Across the street, parked in the shadows, a black car door opened. And out stepped Noela Rukundo, the woman Kalala had paid to have killed, the same woman whose funeral he had just finished hosting. Kalala was facing the house, thanking the last few mourners, when he heard the footsteps. He turned around. At first, he didn't move, his eyes locked onto her, like he was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then his lips parted, his hands rose slowly to the sides of his face, and he stumbled backward. "Is it a ghost?" he whispered. Noela kept walking, her eyes never leaving his. "Surprise," she said. "I'm still alive." Kalala's body collapsed under him. He dropped to his knees and started sobbing. Real tears this time. His hands gripped the air like he was trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through. He crawled toward her, wailing, begging, "Please forgive me. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I was confused." But it was too late for apologies.
When he saw me, it was, oh my goodness, he's like, he see a ghost. He see, I don't know, he was like he needs somewhere to hiding himself. I can see how he's screaming. He say, "Oh, I'm finished." He talk himself, "I'm finished," and then he talk to his back home language too. "I'm finished." "Noela, are you alive?" I say, I'm surprised I'm alive. He touch me like a 2-time jump to make sure I'm...
She reached into her coat, pulled out her phone, and made the call she had rehearsed in her head over and over again. "This is Noela Rukundo," she told the operator. "I need the police. My husband paid people to kill me. I have proof." That same day, Kalala was arrested in Melbourne. He didn't resist, in fact. When the police told him why he was being detained, he didn't even ask how they found out. He just stared ahead and nodded, as if he already knew his game was over. At the station, faced with the recording, he couldn't deny what he said. And now, the man who once claimed to love her, who fathered 3 children with her, who kissed her goodbye before sending her to her death, was headed to court to face the weight of his own words, and there was no undoing what he had done. On the 11th of December 2015, the courtroom fell into a hush as Balenga Kalala stood before the judge in Melbourne's Supreme Court. The phone recording, the receipts, the witness statements, it was all there, so he pleaded guilty to incitement to murder. The sentence was clear: 9 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 6. But even with the verdict, her battle wasn't over. In the days following Kalala's sentencing, Noela hoped for peace. But instead of support, she found herself under fire. Within parts of the Congolese community in Melbourne, the backlash was swift and cruel. Some accused her of betraying her husband. Others whispered that she had brought shame to the community by going to the police instead of keeping it within the family. Strangers began showing up near her home. Threatening messages appeared on her doorstep. And then, one day, she returned to find the back door broken and the front locks damaged. She called the police again, but this time, the danger wasn't from her husband. It was from those who thought she should have kept quiet. Afraid for her children, Noela reached out to Human Services. She requested emergency relocation. She needed a new home, somewhere safe, somewhere unknown. But the trauma didn't end with her. Her children, 8 in total, 5 from a previous marriage and 3 with Kalala, were forced to come to terms with what their father had done. Noela Rukundo didn't just survive an assassination plot. She lived through one of the most personal betrayals imaginable. And somehow, even after everything, she still chose to speak with grace. When asked what she felt about Kalala, the man who had organized her kidnapping and ordered her death, she replied with, "I forgive him. Let God judge him." But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean she thought justice had truly been served. She was clear about that too. 9 years is not enough. That man is evil. She believed he should have received a life sentence, not just for what he tried to do, but for what he put her and their children through, for the years of control, fear, and hidden violence that built up to that moment in Bujumbura. So, while the courts had finished their part, Noela's journey was far from over. She had 8 children to raise, a community to navigate, and wounds that would take time to heal. But she focused forward, not back. She changed her name, moved homes, found work, and slowly started living again. "God is great," she said. "I will marry again."
Me. I think the 9 years they give to him, 6 years and the 3 years for Polo, I think it's not enough for him because that man is evil. I will marry again. By the God's grace, I will marry again because I think for this one I was a long marriage. I will marry again.
In April 2022, Kalala walked free after serving just 6 years of his 9-year sentence. He was reportedly released to live in Rockbank, Victoria, a quiet suburb far from the courtroom where he had once wept and begged.